Hello and welcome to the Atoll, your home for Waterworld fandom. In today's video, we'll be diving back into more Waterworld lost media by taking a look at everything we know about the canceled PlayStation / 3DO Waterworld game. So without further ado, let's see what we can uncover about this all but forgotten piece of video gaming history. So, as many of us know, video games based on movies were for decades a staple of the video game industry. In the 80s, 90s, and all the way through the aughts, pretty much every major film franchise was virtually guaranteed to have a tie-in video game. And this totally made sense. The games, which were typically made on the cheaper end, were themselves a piece of marketing for the film, and in turn, the public's awareness of the film would help boost sales of the game. The whole system created a nice internal synergy that would usually make the development of these tie-in games a profitable one. And so it was only fitting that Waterworld, with its potential of being a blockbuster hit, would receive its own lineup of tie-in games. Now, interestingly, the Waterworld video game license was actually divided between two different companies, allowing Ocean Software to create games on a range of Nintendo and Sega home consoles, while also allowing Interplay Entertainment to create a real-time strategy game for the PC, as well as a more action-based game for the PlayStation, now known as the PS1, and the 3DO Interactive multiplayer, both of which were brand new, yet-to-be-released platforms on the home console market. Interplay would further divvy up the development among two UK-based teams, with Intelligent Games tackling the PC strategy-based game, and Software Creations taking on the action-based game, the game which we'll be talking about today. Software Creations, formed in 1985 in Manchester, England, were best known for their games based on existing movie and comic materials, like the movie tie-in game for Cutthroat Island and the notoriously difficult Silver Surfer game on the NES, but also had some original titles like Equinox here, with this glorious box art. Software Creations employee Ste Pickford was given the job of lead designer on the project, and lucky for him, his first task was to fly to Hawaii and take a tour of the ongoing production of Waterworld. Now, funny enough, the other software companies that had obtained the Waterworld license also sent their people at the same time, but to Pickford's surprise, he was the only game developer on site. The personnel sent by Ocean, Nintendo, and Sega were all senior management, staying at 5-star hotels and looking for an excuse to take a company-paid trip out to the Hawaiian Islands. So, before going any further, let's talk a little bit about what Interplay's initial expectations of the Waterworld action game were. Seeing the success of games like Star Wars Rebel Assault, Interplay wanted Software Creations to build a game that used pre-rendered 3D backgrounds with 2D sprite enemies laid over top, creating a gallery shooter style game. However, some skepticism was immediately raised by Pickford, who pointed out that Waterworld's setting on an open ocean might not make the most interesting pre-rendered backgrounds for an on-rail shooter game. Instead, Pickford wanted to create a game more like that of Wave Racer, with dynamic waves and free movement within the game's levels. But Interplay stood their ground, and so Software Creations began development on the light gun style game in August of 1994, almost an entire year before the film's release. After writing a long game design document that would be the roadmap for the development going forward, Pickford assembled a team to begin work on the two versions of the game, with Carleton Handley leading development of the PlayStation version and Peter Scott heading up the development of the 3DO version. Now, I have to say, I reached out to several people involved with the game's creation, and I was very fortunate to have both Handley and Scott lend their memories of working on this title, and so I'll be sprinkling their personal recollections throughout this story. So, as stated before, the 3DO and PlayStation were both new consoles when Software Creations began work on this Waterworld game, and as a result, much of the tech the team used was both state-of-the-art but also uncharted territory, with no one on the team having ever created a game on either platform. Using first-generation dev kits combined with the latest computers on the market, Handley and Scott set out to learn the new coding architecture for their corresponding consoles. But of course, this game with its highly detailed 3D rendered backgrounds was going to take a larger than usual team of digital artists to model and animate the various locations the players would move through. In total, 5 artists were brought onto the project, and for all of them, creating beautifully rendered 3D water was of highest priority. The art team created the 3D background environments using Silicon Graphics workstations running 3ds Max, the 3D computer graphics program produced by Autodesk. The artwork for the 2D sprites was created using a program called Deluxe Paint, an early raster image editor that was quite popular at the time. But what exactly was the structure of the game? Well, the player would be assuming the role of the Mariner and following the general plot of the film over the course of 11 missions. The team chose to make the Mariner more heroic rather than the mortally ambiguous anti-hero we see for much of the film's runtime to help simplify the game's story. As the game began to take shape alongside the film, the team was allowed exclusive access to documents from the production of the movie, including various versions of the script and storyboards, as well as photographs and blueprints of the major set pieces. So, for sure, the game would have hit the major plot points of the film, like the attack on the Atoll or the destruction of the D's, but would have also created entire levels around smaller moments in the movie. For example, the game's first level was titled Get the Limes, in which the player would familiarize themselves with the game's controls by reenacting the first scene of the film, in which the drifter steals the mariner's precious limes. But of course, this level would have had its own video game logic, expanding on this small moment by having players bust open floating crates and collecting the limes hidden within. According to Carleton Handley, of the game's 11 levels, there actually were only a total of 6 levels with pre-rendered backgrounds. He informed me that this screenshot represented the game's level select screen for the pre-rendered sections, so it seems that there would have been the Get the Limes intro level, 2 Atoll levels, one inside and outside of the structure, a barter outpost level, an underwater city level, and of course, a level aboard the D's. And, as reported by this article in PlayStation Plus, in each level players would be destroying specific targets, rescuing friends, killing bosses, and even collecting items necessary for later levels. But you're probably wondering, what were the other 5 levels in the game if there truly was a total of 11 missions? Well, in between each of the pre-rendered levels was going to be a real-time 3D open water sequence aboard the Trimaran to represent the traveling in between locations in which enemies would attack the boat from multiple angles. Unlike the levels with the pre-rendered backgrounds, these open water levels would allow the player more movement, being able to choose which direction they were looking and shooting in order to defend themselves in the Trimaran. And to be honest, we only know bits and pieces about each of the levels in the game, mostly through old video game magazines and through the recollections of the developers themselves. However, as some of you may already know, an early video trailer for the game was released on a 3DO Buffet demo disc, giving us a glimpse into the world this Software Creations was building. Oddly, the trailer does not show us any shooting action, not even an enemy on screen, but what we did get is more like a 3D asset showcase, showing us the vehicles and environments we would encounter in the finished game with a mock-up status bar in the corner. However, looking at some of the screenshots from old video game magazines, it appears that most of the enemies were your sort of generic smoker fodder, along with some innocent atollers hoping not to get caught in the crossfire. During missions, players could acquire power-ups and increase their fire rate and hit area, such as a super machine gun, and there may have also been plans to allow players to upgrade the trimaran in the open water sequences. And I actually asked the developers of the game if they had ever planned to make the game compatible with either of the console's light gun peripherals, seemingly a perfect match for the style of game being made, but was told that the consoles did not yet have those add-ons at the time the game was being created. Now interestingly, it seems that not all of the enemies would have been rendered as 2D sprites. In the between-level cinematics and the real-time open water levels, the enemies would have been rendered as 3D characters. And while I have no images of the enemy types that would have populated the underwater level, I was informed by the developers that players would have taken aim at mines, falling barrels, sharks, and electric eels. Also, I find it interesting to think about what the pre-rendered level at the Barter Outpost would have been like, just being that it's such a small structure for a level to be built around. Perhaps part of that level would have also reenacted the Smoker ambush. And from what I can tell, the D's level would have had players battling through the interior before a final showdown on the deck of the tanker. In addition, I was told that potentially a level aboard Gregor's dirigible was talked about but never fully implemented. As far as the game's bosses, we again don't have too much information. Peter Scott told me he remembered a battle with Nord aboard the deck of the D's. I also found this image in one of the gaming magazines that shows a storyboard of the Deacon and the Smoker army actually making landfall, as well as this screenshot of the D's harbored next to dry land. The developers told me they thought this was from an early version of the game, but since the game was very closely following the working scripts from the film, that combined with the fact that the released real-time strategy game had a very similar ending, has got me actually wondering if the Smokers making it to dry land was also part of an early version of the script for the film as well, but who knows? Alongside the level design, the game's audio was also starting to take shape. According to this article in 3DO magazine, the game would have been narrated by Enola. I asked the developers if they had done any recording sessions with Tina Majorino, but they did not think they had ever gotten to that stage. But apart from the narration, a full musical score was also produced by Manchester's Halle Orchestra, which supposedly had a wide range of cinematic tracks, and I believe you can actually hear one of these on the 3DO Buffet demo disc. In any case, despite all of the talent and efforts of the developers and artists on the team, creating the game proved to be a slow and difficult process, and this mostly came from two external pressures. The first was that the developers were struggling to develop games on consoles that were so new and unproven, and the second was that the script and game design were in constant change, which in turn would eventually lead to a change in leadership as well. So, for the developers, the process of learning the new gaming console's architecture was cumbersome, and the early development kits provided by the console companies did not bring out the full capabilities of these new platforms, in particular the 3DO, which was proving to be incredibly inefficient with its processing power. This meant that the PlayStation version would lead the development process, and then the devs would try to translate any progress made back down to the 3DO version. In the end, the 3DO was not able to handle the real-time open water segments due to frame rate issues, meaning that these segments would need to be cut from that version of the game and potentially replaced with more pre-rendered levels to make up for the missing content, which would result in more delays. But it was not only the game developers that were facing steep challenges. The art team was also encountering constant revisions to the game's story and design. At the height of development, the art team had rendered about 100,000 frames of animation, or at 25 frames per second, the standard in PAL regions, about an hour's worth of video. But as things began to take shape, the rewrites of the film, which was still in production, were reported to the team at Software Creations, and as a result, meant changes would need to be made to the game story as well. This meant that they would need to re-render sections of animated backgrounds, a very time-consuming process on their mid-90s Silicon graphics workstations, with the largest level taking about 2 months to fully render. On top of this, the re-rendered sections would need to be resynced and blended with the 2D elements, adding further complication to the entire process. And even as the game started to take form, it was apparent that even with its beautifully rendered backgrounds, the game's actual design and movement through stages resembled older on-rail shooters like Operation Wolf, and less like the modern on-rail shooters such as Virtua Cop that they were more inspiring towards. At around this point, seeing the team struggling, Ste Pickford gave one last plea to Interplay to abandon the game's on-rail shooter design, but the publishing company refused to budge on their initial plans. Disheartened and frustrated, Pickford made the hard decision and walked away from the project, choosing to move on with his career and eventually move more towards independent game development. In response, Interplay brought on Eitan Aruzi, an outside consultant, to fill the position of lead designer and help bring the game to completion. Aruzi came from the filmmaking industry and had aspirations of becoming a film director, a dream he would eventually fulfill. As a result, he brought a more artistic and cinematic eye to the game's design, but also limited knowledge about the game development process. He wanted to overhaul the game, not only re-rendering existing stages, but also pushing the team to rework the game into a true, real-time 3D experience, which simply would not work with the highly detailed 3D assets and environments they had created for the express purpose of rendering pre-baked backgrounds. In the end, Aruzi's new vision and leadership created animosity between him and the existing team, and ultimately the development slogged along for a few more months before Interplay, frustrated with the progress and seeing that the film had already been released and the buzz around it had died down, finally pulled the plug and cancelled the game. All in all, the PlayStation 1 version was around 80% complete, with playable levels that had entered the playtesting phase, and the 3DO version a bit further behind due to the console's technical limitations. For Ste Pickford, the news came as no surprise, as he felt the game's design was unworkable and a mistake from the beginning. As for the developers, even though the game was cancelled, it did serve as an introduction for creating games on what at the time was the next generation of home consoles, as well as how to better work with the programming language C. Now, before I wrap up this video, I did want to point out that this was not the only cancelled Waterworld game, but that Ocean Software also had 2 cancelled Waterworld games as well, one for the Sega Genesis, also known as the Mega Drive, and one for the Sega Saturn. As many of us fans know, the Sega Genesis game was eventually leaked to the internet and proved to be playable, and in actuality a complete or very near complete game. Unfortunately, the Sega Saturn game has never surfaced, though according to the game's designer, Steve Wojda, the game was completed, ready for production, and a joy to play, but was mysteriously cancelled when a new company took over the American branch of Ocean Software. The game is truly one of the holy grails of lost media for both Sega Saturn and Waterworld fans alike, but hey, there is always the chance it will be leaked and made available to the internet, so perhaps, if we're lucky, that will be a story for another day. As for Interplay's PlayStation and 3DO game, it seems the chances of a playable game surfacing are slim to none. After the game was cancelled, the team quickly moved on to new projects, happy to leave the difficult development of the action Waterworld game in their rear-view mirror. I asked Carleton, Handley, and Peter Scott if they had any remains of the game, but unfortunately both seemed very doubtful. Handley informed me that the work was backed up on digital audio tapes, and he even held on to one for a while but lost it during a house move. Scott also had a similar story, telling me that he still had the Mac he developed the 3DO game on in his garage, but was doubtful that it would even boot up. And yeah, that is pretty much everything we know about this game that never saw the light of day. And from what I've learned, I feel that the game's design had potential with stunning graphics and simple but fun shoot-'em-up action that, to me, looks more compelling than the standard side-scrolling platformers so commonly associated with the movie tie-in games from the mid-90s. And so I feel that, like almost everything associated with Waterworld, it had very large ambitions, and that ultimately these lofty goals are what led to its struggling development and eventual cancellation. And at least to me, it's this mystery of the game that never was that I find so alluring. You just have to wonder, what was the game actually like to play? Well, unfortunately, in this case, we'll probably never know. But before I end this video, I have to give a few shoutouts. A big thanks to YouTube user AlanBallon3539 who helped dig up some of the PlayStation Plus articles that reported on the production of this game. Also, I have to give a massive shout out to the website GamesThatWeren't.com and their book that they released in 2020. This archival project is dedicated to documenting unreleased, canceled, and prototype games, and in their hardcover book they actually have an entire chapter dedicated to Interplay's canceled Waterworld game and a collection of screenshots and old gaming magazine articles on their website. This became an invaluable source when researching and writing this video, linked to their website in the description below. And of course, I have to give a huge thanks to Carleton, Handley, and Peter Scott for lending their memories on what the game and its development were actually like. I feel very honored to have been able to include their first-hand perspective here in this video. And there you have it, that is my investigative look into the cancelled Waterworld PlayStation/3DO game. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a thumbs up, and before you go, give me your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think this game would have actually been any good? Also, if you haven't already, subscribe to the Atoll. We have a large back library of videos to explore and more planned for the future. And finally, check out the Atoll on Instagram for even more Waterworld content, or contact me via the channel's email. But with that, thanks, as always, for joining me at the Atoll.